That morning, nobody knew the most elite warriors in Europe were sailing toward a trap set by the very men who had paid for their loyalty. October 986 AD, 200 Jomsviking longships cut through the gray waters of the North Sea like blades seeking blood. At their head sailed Palnatok, the legendary warlord who had built the most feared mercenary force in Viking history. Behind him followed Sigvaldi Strutt Haraldsson, whose cunning had made the Jomsvikings wealthy beyond any warrior's dreams. Most feared of all, Thorkel the High, whose axe had never failed to claim victory for whoever could afford his price. These were not ordinary Vikings raiding for plunder. These were the Jomsvikings, professional soldiers whose loyalty could be purchased, but whose courage could never be questioned. Warriors who had sworn sacred oaths to fight to the death for any master willing to pay their price, who believed their legendary reputation protected them from the political games that destroyed lesser men, who had no idea they were sailing toward the Hjörungavágr straits to die in a battle orchestrated by their own employers. The Jomsvikings represented something unprecedented in Viking civilization. Not raiders bound by kinship or warriors serving tribal chiefs, but professional soldiers who fought for gold rather than glory. Their fortress on Jomsburg Island had become the most exclusive military academy in Northern Europe. Warriors who sought membership faced trials that killed half the applicants. Those who survived swore oaths that bound them to absolute obedience and mutual loyalty. No Jomsviking could show fear in battle. No Jomsviking could flee from combat. No Jomsviking could survive longer than his companions, if defeat seemed certain. They had transformed Viking warfare from tribal raiding into professional military service. But professionalism carried a price they were only beginning to understand. The contract that brought them to Norwegian waters had seemed like every other commission in their legendary career. King Svend Forkbeard of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth's son, needed military support for his ambitions against Norwegian King Olaf Tryggvason. The terms were generous beyond even Jomsviking standards. 50 talents of silver for naval support, additional payments for every Norwegian nobleman killed. Most attractive of all, territorial grants in any conquered Norwegian lands. For mercenaries who had served the richest rulers in Europe, the offer represented the ultimate prize, not just wealth, but the chance to rule kingdoms they had conquered through professional skill. But Svend Forkbeard had studied Jomsviking psychology with the same attention he devoted to battlefield tactics. He understood that their greatest strength, absolute loyalty to contractual obligations, could become their greatest weakness if manipulated correctly. What the Jomsvikings saw as generous terms he saw as the cost of eliminating the most dangerous mercenary force in Europe. The contract that seemed to offer them everything they desired was actually designed to destroy them in a way that would serve Danish interests while removing potential threats to Danish power. The secret negotiations that preceded the Hjörungavágr campaign revealed how completely the Jomsvikings had been isolated from the political realities that would determine their fate. While Palnatok prepared his warriors for what he believed would be a straightforward military operation, Svend Forkbeard was coordinating with Earl Håkon of Norway to create the most sophisticated trap ever laid for professional soldiers. The two rulers who should have been enemies were actually allies whose shared interest in eliminating the Jomsvikings transcended their territorial disputes. Captain Bui the Broad commanded the lead squadron of Jomsviking vessels, with the confidence of a man who had never experienced betrayal by an employer. The massive warrior from Zealand had served in the Jomsviking ranks for 20 years, through campaigns that had terrorized rulers from Ireland to Russia. His iron beard had been tested against the finest warriors Europe could produce. His tactical innovations had made Jomsviking naval warfare the standard by which all other fleets were measured. But 20 years of professional success had not prepared him for the possibility that success itself might become a liability that employers would eliminate rather than reward. The intelligence network that made Jomsviking operations so effective had been systematically compromised by enemies who understood how that network functioned. Agents who reported Jomsviking movements to their commanders were also reporting those same movements to Earl Haakon's forces. Communication lines that coordinated Jomsviking tactics were simultaneously coordinating the trap being prepared for them. Most devastating, the financial arrangements that funded Jomsviking operations were being used to track their strength and predict their strategic decisions. The approach to Hjörungavágr revealed the first signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the campaign. The Jomsvikings were fighting Norwegian resistance, which intelligence had predicted would be scattered and demoralized, proved to be organized and well-informed. Enemy forces appeared in positions that should have been unknown to them. Most troubling, Norwegian tactics seemed designed specifically to counter Jomsviking advantages, as if someone had provided detailed information about how the legendary mercenaries actually fought. Young Havard the Black noticed the discrepancies first, his sharp eyes trained to spot tactical inconsistencies that might indicate enemy preparation. The 18-year-old son of a Jomsviking veteran had grown up listening to stories of campaigns where superior intelligence gave them decisive advantages over enemies who couldn't match their professionalism. But the patterns he observed around Hjörungavágr suggested enemies who knew Jomsviking capabilities better than the Jomsvikings knew Norwegian preparations. The battle formation that Earl Haakon deployed against the approaching Jomsviking fleet demonstrated tactical sophistication that shocked professional warriors accustomed to fighting amateur opponents. Norwegian ships positioned to exploit weaknesses in Jomsviking standard formations, coordinated movements that suggested extensive planning rather than improvised responses. Most ominous, timing that indicated the Norwegian commander knew exactly when and where the Jomsviking attack would come. The trap had been prepared with the precision that came from inside information, but the Jomsvikings had sworn oaths that prevented retreat. Regardless of the odds they faced, their legendary code demanded that they fight to completion any battle they began, even if victory became impossible. What made them the most feared mercenaries in Europe, absolute commitment to contractual obligations, became the chains that bound them to destruction. They could see approaching but could not avoid. Honor and professionalism merged into a death sentence disguised as military virtue. The naval engagement that followed redefined medieval understanding of organized warfare. 200 Jomsviking ships, each crewed by warriors whose individual skill exceeded anything European battlefields had previously seen, fought against Norwegian forces whose numbers and coordination seemed impossible given the intelligence the mercenaries had received. The battle that should have been a demonstration of professional superiority over amateur resistance became a grinding struggle where elite warriors discovered that information superiority could overcome individual excellence. Sigvaldi Strutt Haraldsson realized the scope of the betrayal when Norwegian forces demonstrated knowledge of Jomsviking tactical innovations that had never been shared outside the Brotherhood. Enemy commanders anticipated maneuvers that were supposed to be trade secrets. Norwegian responses countered Jomsviking advances with precision that suggested extensive preparation. Most shocking, Earl Haakon's fleet seemed to know exactly which Jomsviking ships carried which commanders, targeting leadership with accuracy that could only come from detailed intelligence. The boarding actions that determined individual ship-to-ship encounters showcased the legendary skill that had made Jomsviking service the most expensive military option in Northern Europe. Warriors whose axes could split shields with single strokes, archers whose arrows found gaps in armor that seemed impossible to penetrate, ship handlers whose seamanship allowed maneuvers that defied conventional naval limitations. But individual excellence meant nothing when strategic deception had created impossible odds, and political manipulation had isolated them from any possibility of support or retreat. Thorkel the High led the counterattack that temporarily restored Jomsviking momentum. His personal combat skills, so devastating that entire Norwegian crews abandoned their vessels rather than face him in close combat. The champion, whose reputation had made kings negotiate rather than fight, demonstrated why Jomsviking warriors commanded premium prices for their service. His axe work was poetry written in blood. His tactical decisions were masterpieces of professional violence. His leadership inspired men who knew they were dying to fight, as if victory remained possible. But the revelation that destroyed Jomsviking morale came when captured Norwegian documents revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had brought them to Hjörungavágr. Letters between Svein Forkbeard and Earl Håkon discussing how to eliminate the Jomsviking problem permanently. Financial records showing Danish payments for Norwegian cooperation in destroying the mercenary brotherhood. Most devastating, detailed intelligence about Jomsviking capabilities that could only have come from someone with access to their most closely guarded secrets. The psychological impact of betrayal by their employer shattered the unity that had made Jomsviking forces invincible in previous campaigns. Warriors, whose loyalty had never been questioned, began to doubt whether their comrades could be trusted. Commands that should have been obeyed without hesitation were debated and delayed. Most catastrophic, the absolute discipline that distinguished professional soldiers from tribal warriors broke down when men realized they were dying for employers who had planned their destruction from the beginning. The final phase of the battle revealed how completely political manipulation could triumph over military excellence when applied with sufficient sophistication. Individual Jomsviking ships, isolated from mutual support by tactical deceptions that had been planned for months, found themselves overwhelmed by Norwegian forces whose coordination suggested extensive rehearsal. The professional soldiers who had dominated European battlefields through superior organization discovered that organization could be turned against them by enemies who understood how their systems worked. Captain Bui the Broad made his final stand on the deck of his burning longship, surrounded by the bodies of men who had followed him through 20 years of victorious campaigns. The warrior whose iron beard had become legendary throughout Europe faced the reality that legend meant nothing when politics determined the conditions under which battles were fought. His last words, according to survivors, were a curse upon employers who purchased loyalty only to destroy those who provided it. The drowning of Jomsviking vessels in the Hjörungavágr straits became a symbol of how professional military service could be corrupted by political interests that transcended simple battlefield victory. Ships that had carried the finest warriors in Europe to the bottom of the North Sea with their crews still fighting, men who had never shown fear in combat, choosing death over surrender to enemies who had been their employers' allies. The destruction was complete, systematic, and politically motivated in ways that traditional Viking warfare had never contemplated. Palnatoke's capture alive provided Earl Håkon with the opportunity to demonstrate what happened to mercenaries who became too powerful for their employers' comfort. The Jomsviking leader, who had built the most effective military organization in Northern Europe, was executed not as an enemy warrior, but as a political problem that required elimination. His death marked the end of an era when professional soldiers could maintain independence from the rulers who purchased their services. The 200 Jomsviking ships that had sailed toward Hjörungavágr, carrying the most elite warriors in Europe, had carried more than military power. They had carried the dream that professional excellence could create independence from the political games that destroyed lesser men. Their destruction in the straits where their employer's betrayal was finally revealed marked the end of that dream. The most feared mercenaries in Viking history had discovered that no amount of military skill could protect them from masters who had decided their elimination served political purposes better than their continued existence.